Hi, welcome back. This is part 2 of our 3-part series. If you watched my previous video, you can skip ahead. You do not need to hear this. We already know each other. But for those of you who are maybe just joining, my name is Amy Ellis. I use she, her pronouns. I have my doctorate in clinical psychology. And right now I'm an assistant professor and the director of the Trauma Resolution and Integration Program at Nova Southeastern University. I run a training clinic there where we see and work with prolonged and repeated trauma survivors, primarily, but also see a host of other traumatic sequelae and folks. So in this video, we're going to get started on really understanding some of our foundational studies on adverse childhood experiences and how that's kind of affected our understanding of increased risk factors in adulthood. As I mentioned, I do a lot of work with adult survivors of trauma, and so the ACEs study is really pivotal to that. And we'll talk about how we can maybe expand on that kind of initial framework and really go beyond to fully understand how trauma can impact an individual beyond just the event. So let's jump in. The Adverse Childhood Experiences study is a really cool one. It was developed in the mid-1980s, and hold on for a second, you're going to think this has nothing to do with trauma. It was a study that was looking at a weight loss program to reduce obesity. And they kept noticing that there's like this high dropout rate, and they started panicking, as many researchers do, of why are people not doing my program? And so in doing that, they decided to conduct interviews. And there was a level of misspeaking. They were asking, how much did you weigh when you were first sexually active? And so it's interesting language, right? For a childhood sexual abuse survivor, you might kind of regard that as, well, when was I sexually active? When did I consent to that? Or maybe, when was I forced into a sexual act that perhaps I didn't want, right? So we've got that kind of framework. And as they started getting more answers, they really found that it was childhood sexual abuse that was extremely common among these dropouts. So, is there something about dropping out, the effect of childhood sexual abuse, maybe not adhering to the program? The wheels are turning. Let me delve a little bit more into the study. It's huge. They took over 17,000 women and men, about half of each, and they were receiving their healthcare services. Each person got this health questionnaire, and then they were also emailed some, email wasn't even a thing then. They were also mailed something 2 weeks later to complete. And what they found is not only that childhood sexual abuse was incredibly common, but that there were actually 9 additional factors that are associated with a host of medical issues. Obesity is one of them. We're also talking things like cancer, diabetes, mental disorders, and perhaps the worst, a reduced life expectancy. So the more ACEs that someone endorsed, the higher number of these events or experiences, the more likely, the stronger the association that they're going to experience chronic illness and disorders and so on. So from the original study, we know that there's these 3 categories. One are our abuse categories. We know that folks who are exposed to childhood sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and physical abuse are more likely to experience these outcomes. That makes sense. There's also a category of neglect. And so that includes physical and emotional neglect. Interestingly, physical neglect, but not emotional neglect, would meet a criterion A definition of PTSD in the DSM. And so as we talked about in the previous video, our diagnosis explicitly states that the event has to be life-threatening, threatening our life, our safety, etc., but it doesn't include things that are ego-threatening, which we can all agree emotional neglect would certainly be. It does not mean that emotional neglect is any less salient or any less impactful. Certainly, as we can see, this is actually an argument for, again, that flawed definition in the DSM. As we can see, emotional neglect, physical neglect, abuse categories are all associated with the same outcomes. So it warrants further discussion of like, maybe this should be part of that. And then the final category, which is the one that always intrigues me the most, is family environment components. Having a family member who has a mental illness, someone who's incarcerated, someone who's struggled with or had a substance abuse disorder, it's coming from a family where there's divorced parents or witnessing intimate partner violence. Let me add a couple of notes. The research technically in this study only examined fathers treating mothers with violence. So whereas I like to extend it to partners and keeping it more broad, technically the research showed that future research does show it doesn't matter the gender, it doesn't matter who's treating who. Essentially just watching any sort of relational violence is key in developing some of these outcomes. But I just wanted to make that really clear there. The research shows us that 60% of adults have encountered at least one ACE. I'm going to argue that makes sense. We know that nearly 50% of marriages end in divorce. So having a divorce as an ACE, that's going to be fairly common and ubiquitous. But what's more surprising and more devastating is when we look at the statistics around multiple ACEs. So if you actually see this as it goes on, folks who have experienced 4 or more ACEs, it's almost 16% of adults. So we can take a few things away from the ACEs study. 1, ACEs do not occur alone. Quite often, people who are exposed to one ACE are likely going to be exposed to multiple ACEs. When we have multiple ACEs, we know that increases our likelihood of having some sort of medical or psychiatric issue. Point 2, if as mental health therapists, we're just treating the abuse portion, right, that one category, it's only 3 of the 10 ACEs, we're missing out on a whole host of other factors that need to be addressed and part of treatment, like the family environment, upbringing, and the family unit, etc. In fact, what we actually know about is that individuals who experience repeated and prolonged trauma, they show very unique family constellations. It's characterized by more conflict. These families often show more control exerted over their family members. There's less cohesiveness among the family members. And actually, my team at TRIP, we're working on finding a 4th characteristic that's evolved. In a lot of these families, there's a strong emphasis on achievement. It sounds like it could be a good thing, and it can be if it existed in isolation. But because it's existing with high conflict, high control, and low cohesion, it basically means that it's these families that are high on control and structure. They strongly push for achievement, and there's a lot of high expectations and performance. So it's a tense, stressful, chaotic experience. I feel like we need to really examine how family environment may impact the lack of development of skills, right? So like if you have a family that just exerts control, they're not teaching you how to critically think or problem solve or do anything for yourself. If you have a family where there's no cohesion, you're not learning how to be intimate and connected. If you have a family environment that just focuses on performance, you might be less likely to try things that you don't do well at or succeed in, and just constantly avoid anything that makes you feel like you're really working harder or you might not get it. So you can see how all of these things would certainly then impact those experiences of childhood abuse, right? Abuse, trauma, we already know that people are questioning their self-worth, their value, they're experiencing all this kind of self-doubt perhaps. And then we have this lack of a foundational experience of, I am worthwhile, I am valued, I am good enough. So perhaps our treatment really needs to encompass both avenues, focusing on the traumatic events, but certainly not at the expense of looking at family factors and processing that, and then also perhaps giving some skills to compensate for said family environments. But still, there's more. The ACEs study is not without its limitations. It's foundational, but it only focused on the individual and the family environment. It didn't look at any outside influences. So with additional studies, we've actually been able to see that it's not just those 10 original ACEs, but we also have effects from the outside community, like peer bullying and isolation, exposure to community violence, reduced safety in one's community, discrimination and stigmatization, even being in the foster system. And with this new study, we also get new numbers for those prevalence rates. So whereas that first study was telling us that 60% of people are going to be exposed to one ACE at some point in their lifetime, now it's 80%. Whereas in that first study, we found that it was around 16% of people who had 4 or more ACEs. In this new version, this new revised version, it's 37% of individuals. So almost 40% of people are experiencing 4 or more ACEs, greatly increasing their risk for adverse outcomes in childhood. So as I kind of move into just kind of understanding the prevalence of sexual trauma, which is what I'll be focusing on, I just want to add a note of the importance of the ACEs in preventative work. A lot of times as clinicians, we are working with people who have already experienced the trauma. It is post-trauma that we're having people in our office. Imagine a way where we could actually spot these things occurring in real time in a child's life. Imagine that a child goes to the doctor, the pediatrician, and the pediatrician is able to go through this quick checklist asking about abuse in the home, asking about family environment, divorce, family members, and mental illness, substance use, incarceration, asking about experiences in neighborhoods and with peers. That's really at the forefront. If we had pediatricians assessing for this routinely, repeatedly, we could actually catch things before we get to these adverse outcomes through therapy, through improved family structures, and so on. So I just want to make that clear that the ACEs are pretty revolutionary. And while some pediatricians are certainly using this, more need to be. So as I said, we're going to focus a little bit more on some prevalence rates, really focusing on kind of that category, the pink category of abuse and sexual trauma. I want to also make it clear that it's not to say that sexual trauma is worse than physical trauma or emotional trauma. That's really just primarily where my research has focused. Again, what we know is that it's often not occurring in isolation. Folks who primarily report physical trauma often report incidents of sexual trauma. Folks who predominantly report sexual trauma in their lifetime report emotional and physical. So these things do not occur in isolation. It's estimated that almost 30% of heterosexual men have experienced some sort of rape or physical violence at the hands of an intimate partner. When we break that down by affectional orientation, it actually looks like 26% of gay men and 37% of bisexual men who report having a sexual assault. So slightly more bisexual men are at increased risk for having been exposed to these types of factors. Almost 20% of heterosexual men have been exposed to sexual violence other than rape, and gay men and bisexual men endorse even higher rates, 40% and 47% respectively. When we look at women, we're seeing that 35% report rape, physical violence, etc., by an intimate partner, but an astounding 44% of lesbian women and 61% of bisexual women report these assaults. And while only 17% of heterosexual women and 13% of lesbian women report sexual violence other than rape, 46% of bisexual women report sexual violence other than rape. Almost 50% of trans individuals are sexually assaulted in their lifetime, 1 in 2. So in sum, what this tells us is that being bisexual and gay means a higher prevalence for rates of rape, physical violence, and sexual violence. Astonishing. We can also break this down by other factors like race, where we know that Black and American Indian, Alaskan Native men report higher levels of sexual victimization by a partner as compared to white counterparts. We also know that American Indian, Alaskan Native women and then mixed race women report higher levels of sexual victimization as compared to white counterparts. So not only are there high rates of sexual trauma and victimization, but we also see that your affectional orientation and being a person of color disproportionately exposes someone to sexual violence at higher rates. Unfortunately, we do not have specific rates of sexual violence for trans individuals who are people of color. It's lacking. We know it. What I can share, though, is that we know trans people of color are at increased risk for increased police violence compared to white trans folks, and that 79% of LGBTQIA plus hate crimes are actually against trans people of color. And the highest rate of murder and violence is for trans women of color. So I hope that puts things into perspective in terms of really understanding how trauma doesn't exist in just a vacuum. We also have to understand multiple other factors. So let's segue. In the other videos, we've discussed how there's certain risk factors for developing PTSD. Here, we're actually going to be talking more about how those factors kind of influence the development of trauma and how they maybe maintain and contribute to the experience of trauma. So on this slide, we see that this is a model developed by Simpson to understand intersectionality, to really understand all of the forces, all of the components that affect a person's identity and that aren't operating in isolation, that really are at the center of who they are. So as we see in here, the center of this diagram shows that it's the person's identity, their power, and privilege, right? As we expand out, we're talking about factors that are perhaps minoritized by our mainstream society. So you'll see things like income level, gender, age. What all of these things assume is that there's a majority, right, or an expectation, a societal norm that is the default. And then anything but, that's minoritized, that's cast off, that's othered, it's different. So in this example, the idea is, the expectation is with sexuality, is that by default, people are heterosexual. And that's what we mean by saying that we live in a heteronormative culture and society. It means that on average, by default, when we're exchanging pleasantries with someone, the assumption is I'm heterosexual. And if I'm anything but heterosexual, then it's up to me to kind of volunteer and say, oh, nope, I'm an other, I'm different. Obviously, that's not saying that people need to out themselves, etc., but it's about that experience of being othered, whether they come out or not. And so if you imagine, you kind of expand that outwards again, we're looking at all of the isms, right? Racism, ableism, ethnocentrism, classism, sexism. It's all of the things that operate in our society that says, hey, you're othered. That's not okay. We want you to fit into being male. We want you to be Christian. We want you to be middle-aged. We want you to be, etc., right? Whatever the mainstream norm is considered. And so as we kind of even go even farther out, we understand how when the individual is interacting with different systems like education, legal, politics even, etc., that obviously this affects the way in which they're going through the world. So let's just take like an example of a practicing Muslim woman, right? We're going to take it even outside of trauma. A practicing Muslim woman might be exposed to issues like discrimination and ethnocentrism, as well as sexism. So clearly the way that she moves through society and how she views things is very different than we would say to a Christian man, right? Or a white Christian man would. And so as we look at this, this is our way of understanding how various parts of our identity speak volumes to how we view the world, how the world sees us and interacts with us, and then how we view and interact with others. Let's add in the trauma component. There's going to be a difference in how people experience the trauma, but also how they perceive it, and then also how the world perceives and reacts to it. So, for example, a Black man in his 60s who reports childhood sexual abuse. Clearly, this is a man who's going to experience colorism, racism, ageism, being in his 60s. This is going to influence how he navigates and interacts with the world. But it's also going to impact how systems interact with him. When he reports or discloses his trauma, if he should, he's maybe unlikely to be believed because there's the perception that Black men are less credible or should be stronger and more stoic. We're going to see that he might face discrimination because he's a man reporting childhood sexual abuse, and there's toxic masculinity beliefs around, men can't be raped. So the trauma and his ability to disclose, even his ability to kind of navigate responses to the disclosure, are going to be severely impacted by how he's navigating the world. And so as therapists, we have to be mindful. Again, we don't want to just work on the trauma, right? There's 3 ACE categories. We don't just want to explore those effects of traumatization. We really want to understand family environment and environment as a whole, because that compounds how someone is experiencing their trauma. So more specifically, the chronic stress and accumulation of discrimination and stigmatizing experiences that build up is called minority stress. This is the chronic stress that we experience from living in a predominantly white, Christian, upper to middle class, cis-normative, heteronormative society. And so in one of our earlier videos, we talked about big T and little t trauma events. Here, I want to kind of bring back that discussion. So we can clearly appreciate that being stigmatized, being discriminated, constantly having to prove worth, being afraid of police interactions, like these chronic experiences are going to lead to post-traumatic stress reactions, right? They're going to lead someone to be more hypervigilant. They're going to have them maybe avoid certain places and things. It's going to encourage, foster a sense of self-blame and lowered self-worth. It makes sense. But we have an issue. Our criterion A trauma does not include this because it's ego-threatening, not life-threatening. We have another problem. The disorder, it's called post-traumatic stress disorder. What happens when it's peri-traumatic? In other words, we're treating people who have experienced an event or events of trauma, and when they're coming into our therapy room, presumably the trauma has ended. What do we do when we're working with folks who are coming in and they can't escape the marginalization, the discrimination, and the stigmatization? We can't really use those same treatments at all because we don't want to keep exposing somebody to something that they're already experiencing. So it really begs the question of what kind of nuanced treatment do we need there? So, in sum from this video, we know that mental health therapists need to be addressing not just our big T, 3 ACEs, but also our little t experiences of trauma that are not just limited to the individual, but the family environment and also the larger socio-political culture in which clients live. I will make the argument and the case that our work as clinicians should not just be on the micro level, essentially not just working with people one-on-one in therapy and in that room, but really it's our duty, it's perhaps part of our ethics to advocate and be larger voices in a social context of educating and voicing for those who are not in positions of power and privilege. I think it's also about getting involved in politics and legislature. There's lots of things that we can do. And so as a trauma therapist, we shouldn't just be learning interventions to help the individual. We should be learning strategies and policies for changing our larger socio-political context. That's what it really means to be trauma-informed. Thanks.